When Pretty Woman was first being cast, Julia Roberts wasn't anyone's first choice. She was just 21, barely known. No one could have predicted she'd become America's sweetheart, let alone the face of one of the most iconic romantic comedies in Hollywood history. At the time, all the studio saw was a risky unknown, trying to fill a role that had already terrified bigger names. The original script was darker, grittier, and it scared off every A-lister from Michelle Pfeiffer to Meg Ryan. Julia? She just needed a chance. She was young and broke. She came from a working-class background in Georgia, raised by a single mother after her parents split. Acting had always felt like a dream, but it was Richard Gere, the seasoned star with years of prestige and charm, who held the keys to that dream becoming real. When she first walked into the room for the read-through, she knew she wasn't supposed to be there. She could feel it in the way people looked at her, like she was just a placeholder. Then she met Richard. He was calm, collected. His reputation in the industry was almost intimidating. The gray hair, the tailored suits, the quiet authority. It all stood in stark contrast to her own anxious energy. She couldn't tell what he thought of her, and truthfully, neither could the producers. In those first few days, Julia felt small, like a child trying on adult shoes and tripping over every step. She would later say she cried more than once in her trailer, wondering if she was about to blow the biggest opportunity of her life. But Richard saw something in her. Not immediately, not all at once, but during an early table read, with just the two of them and a quiet corner of a Beverly Hills office, something shifted. Her voice cracked during a line, completely out of character, but instead of brushing past it, Richard paused. He looked at her gently and said, "That's exactly how she'd sound." Everyone else had told her to polish the character, to refine Vivian into something more digestible. Richard, he saw the value in the cracks, the fear, the uncertainty. It was in that moment that Julia realized he wasn't just acting alongside her. He was guiding her. What people don't know is that Pretty Woman wasn't some overnight fairy tale. The tone changed midway through development. The script was rewritten. The characters softened. But through it all, Julia's presence grew stronger. Not because she forced it, but because Richard quietly made space for it. And in the process, something unspoken began to form between them. It wasn't romantic, but it was intimate, built on trust, on silence, on shared glances between takes. She never expected him to say the things he said, and she certainly never expected to carry them with her for the next 3 decades. But one night, after the crew packed up and the studio lights dimmed, Richard said something, not in character, not as a joke, but as a man who'd seen what this business could do to someone like her. And from that moment on, Julia knew she wasn't just acting in Pretty Woman. She was stepping into something much more complicated, something she couldn't talk about. Not yet. Richard Gere wasn't going to do Pretty Woman. He had already passed on the role more than once. The script, in its early stages, didn't speak to him. Felt thin, unfocused. The story of a wealthy businessman and a young escort? It risked being shallow, even exploitative. And Richard, already a respected figure with serious roles under his belt, wasn't interested in playing a cardboard cutout. He walked away, but the studio didn't give up. They wanted him badly, so they brought him in for one more meeting, this time with Julia Roberts. It wasn't supposed to be anything serious, just a final courtesy, a way to say they tried. Julia was nervous. She knew Richard hadn't agreed to the film. She knew he might leave the room and never come back. And she also knew, deep down, that this role could change everything for her. But only if he said yes. So she did something bold. During that meeting, while the producers talked, while Gere looked politely unimpressed, Julia picked up a pen and a scrap of paper. Without a word, she slid it across the table. Richard glanced down. It said, "Please say yes." He smiled, just a little, and for the first time in the meeting, something shifted. It wasn't the line that moved him. It was her. The vulnerability, the earnestness, the way she wasn't playing a part. She was just being Julia. Young, brave, unpolished. It hit him in a place he didn't expect. Because behind all the money, the fame, the image he had built over decades, Richard remembered what it felt like to be her, desperate for a break, waiting on someone else's decision to determine your fate. He said yes. The moment became legend, and it marked the beginning of a quiet, unspoken connection between them. Richard didn't announce it. He didn't tell anyone he planned to protect her. But that's exactly what he did. From the very first table read, he adjusted to her rhythm. He gave her space to breathe on screen. He let her own scenes that, in lesser hands, would have swallowed her whole. But it wasn't just acting. One night, after a long shoot, they were sitting on the edge of the soundstage. The lights were low, the crew had left, and it was just the two of them. He turned to her and said, "This town will pretend to love you, and then it'll chew you up." Julia stayed quiet. Then he added, "You remind me of someone I used to be." And before she could ask what he meant, he leaned closer. "What I'm about to tell you, don't repeat it. Not now. Not until you understand it." She nodded. He told her something then, something deeply personal. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't romantic. But it was real. And it carried the weight of every disappointment, every betrayal, every silent moment he'd endured in the industry. Julia listened and made a promise. She wouldn't share it. Not until she truly understood what he meant. At the time, she thought she did. But now, years later, she realizes she had no idea. It's the moment fans still talk about. Vivian reaches for a necklace. Edward snaps the box shut, suddenly playfully, catching her off guard. Julia lets out a startled laugh, full of joy, full of surprise, and the world fell in love. But what audiences didn't know was, that moment was never meant to happen. It wasn't in the script. It wasn't rehearsed. It was Richard's idea, spontaneous, unplanned, and so perfectly timed that the director decided to leave it in. It would become one of the most iconic scenes in romantic comedy history. But for Julia, it wasn't just a funny blooper. It was a signal. Richard had a way of watching her, not in a controlling way but in a protective one. On set, she often felt vulnerable, even out of place. She was surrounded by seasoned professionals, older actors, hardened crew members. And yet Richard always seemed to know when she needed a hand. That scene, it wasn't just a joke. It was his way of grounding her, of reminding her, mid-take, mid-chaos, that she didn't have to force anything. She was enough. Later that night, after everyone had packed up and gone home, Julia sat quietly on a folding chair near the edge of the set, her makeup still half on, the necklace prop resting in her lap, her mind replaying that moment over and over. Then Richard sat beside her. No cameras, no crew, just the two of them and the silence between takes. And he said something, this time not about the film or the character or the scene they just shot. "I did that because I could tell you were slipping." Julia looked at him, confused. "Not your acting," he clarified. You were starting to think you didn't belong here." She didn't answer because he was right. Then he added, "Don't let them trick you into thinking you're lucky to be here. You're here because you earned it." And then, after a long pause, he leaned in closer and whispered, "They told me the same thing once, and I believed them, and I paid for it." Julia didn't ask what he meant. She didn't have to, because in his voice, she heard something she hadn't heard all day: fear. The kind that lingers for decades. The kind that no award or role or applause can erase. He didn't elaborate. He just said, "One day, you'll know why I said this. And when that day comes, you'll decide if it's yours to tell." Then he stood up, gave her a small nod, and walked off into the dark. And Julia sat there, just 21, alone, with that box in her lap and a truth too heavy to hold. She didn't write it down. She never told anyone, because she wasn't sure what it meant. Not yet. But as the years passed, and the roles came and went, and the spotlight began to change her, she started to understand. That night wasn't just about a scene. It was a warning. And the secret Richard whispered in the dark, it would shape everything she became. The secret wasn't scandalous. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't even about her. It was about him. That's what made it heavier. Because when Richard Gere leaned in that night, on that quiet, empty set, and told Julia something he'd never said aloud before, she felt the weight of it immediately. He told her, in his own careful way, that he'd made compromises, that he'd played the game, that he had once been just like her, young, hopeful, convinced that talent alone was enough to survive in Hollywood. And then he looked her in the eye and said, "There are moments in this business that will ask you to trade pieces of yourself. And you won't even know it's happening until something inside you is already gone." Julia didn't understand then. Not really. She was still new, still soaking it all in. She thought maybe he was just being dramatic or nostalgic or protective. But something in his voice stuck with her. It wasn't bitterness. It was regret. And that's what scared her most. He wasn't warning her because he saw her failing. He was warning her because he saw her succeeding and knew what success could cost. So she made a silent promise that night. She would remember his words. She would carry them. And she would never repeat them, not until she knew what they truly meant. Years went by. Julia became Julia Roberts, America's sweetheart, an Oscar winner, a household name. She walked red carpets, led blockbuster films, and became the woman every director wanted to cast. But behind the charm, behind the smile, that moment with Richard lingered. Because no matter how much success she earned, the trade-offs started to show. Scripts that asked her to be less than she was. Rooms that wanted her to smile, not speak. Offers that seemed golden on the outside but left her feeling hollow by the time the credits rolled. And every time she felt herself slipping, she heard his voice again. "Don't let them trick you into thinking you're lucky to be here." She started seeing the machine behind the glamour. The conversations that weren't about story or character but marketability. The pressure to stay young, stay agreeable, stay exactly what they wanted her to be. She understood now what Richard had meant. That in Hollywood, the most dangerous thing wasn't failure, it was silence. The way it could wrap around your identity and slowly, quietly, erase it. She saw it happen to people she loved. She felt it creeping toward her. And still, she kept the promise. She never shared what Richard had said. Not to co-stars, not to friends. Not even to people who asked, because it wasn't just his secret anymore. It had become hers too. A shared truth between two actors. One just beginning, one already scarred. Spoken in a moment of honesty that neither of them expected. Now, more than 30 years later, she's finally ready to say it. Not for attention, not for nostalgia, but because someone else out there, some young actress sitting on the edge of a set, unsure if she belongs, might need to hear it, and might recognize the voice in the dark. Julia Roberts has kept quiet about what Richard Gere told her for over 3 decades. Not because it wasn't meaningful, but because it was. Because some things live better in silence, at least for a while. But time changes perspective. Fame fades. The pressure to smile on cue starts to feel heavier. And the young woman who once begged Richard to say yes is now old enough to understand why he almost didn't. She's seen it all by now. She's seen promising stars chewed up by the very system that praised them. She's watched directors demand more vulnerability from women while giving them less respect. She's watched women fight harder for roles they've already earned. And somewhere along the way, she started seeing herself not just as Julia Roberts, the actress, but as Vivian again, the girl on the edge of something big. Unsure if she'd be welcomed or broken. And she realized that was the moment Richard saw in her. That's why he warned her. Because he had already stood on that same edge and jumped without a parachute. So why speak now? Because the silence, once protective, started to feel like permission. Permission for the system to keep taking. Permission for the next young woman to walk into a studio office, hand over a piece of herself, and believe that's just the price of success. Julia doesn't want that anymore. She doesn't want to be part of a culture that rewards silence and punishes honesty. So here it is, the truth. That night on set, when the scene was done and the cameras were off, Richard Gere looked at her and said, "You remind me of the part of me I didn't protect. Don't let them take that from you. And don't tell anyone I said this, until you know what it means." At the time, she didn't. Not really. But now, at 56, she knows exactly what he meant, because she's seen the cost of staying silent. She's seen the cost of speaking out, and she's finally decided, if the truth can help even one person hold on to who they are, it's worth telling. So she's telling it, not to make headlines, not to relive the past, but to honor the part of herself that he saw before she ever did. The part he warned her to protect. Because sometimes the most important things we say aren't said on camera. They're whispered, backstage, in moments no one else remembers. And when the lights fade and the applause stops, it's those words that stay with us forever. For most people, Pretty Woman is a fairy tale, a rags to riches story, a modern Cinderella with big hair, high heels, and a prince in a silver limo. But behind that glittering Hollywood fantasy was a very real young woman, a 21-year-old newcomer, thrust into a world she didn't quite understand, and paired with a man who'd already seen too much of it. What the cameras captured was magical, but what they didn't capture, what happened when the lights went off, the costumes came off, and the real people sat in quiet corners of the set, that's the part of the story no one ever told. Until now, Julia Roberts didn't just share scenes with Richard Gere. She shared silence, moments that couldn't be rehearsed, or directed, or repeated. Moments that shaped her, not just as an actress but as a woman. Because what Richard offered her wasn't just kindness. It was insight, a quiet, difficult truth about what this industry can take from you if you're not careful. And a plea to protect the one thing no role can give you, your self-worth. He didn't tell her that to flatter her. He didn't say it as a mentor or a co-star. He said it as a man who had learned the hard way. You remind me of the part of me I didn't protect, he told her. Don't let them take that from you. Those weren't just words. They were a gift, a warning wrapped in compassion. And Julia carried them like a secret she wasn't ready to explain. Not for years. Not until she saw that same look in younger actresses. The mix of excitement and fear, the thrill of opportunity, shadowed by uncertainty. She realized the truth Richard had given her wasn't just meant for her. It was meant for anyone walking into a room where their value is measured in charm, youth, and compliance. So why speak now? Because silence may feel safe, but it also lets the cycle continue. Julia doesn't want to be remembered just for her smile, or her laugh, or the role she played. She wants to be remembered for telling the truth, especially the ones that hurt, especially the ones that matter. And maybe, just maybe, there's a young actress out there right now, sitting on the edge of her first big break, wondering if she belongs, thinking she's lucky to be in the room. Julia's story isn't meant to scare her. It's meant to remind her, you're not lucky, you're worthy. And if someone ever whispers something to you in the quiet, something that stays with you longer than any applause, you'll know it's not just a secret, it's a seed. One day, it might bloom into something someone else needs to hear. Just like this. If this story stayed with you, the next one will stay with you even longer. Watch it now.